Hi, curious people. This is Patty Rich. I'm the host of this podcast, and today is a little different than other episodes that I've recorded. And I had a desire to do something different in honor of my birthday. My birthday happens to fall on Earth Day, which is kind of cool. And as I was reflecting on my life and all the different things I'm doing, I was reflecting on the podcast, and it's been such a fun thing to do and so connecting, and it's really opened up my world in a bigger way. I've just loved it. And so I was thinking about the podcast and all the things I love about it, and also how the audience has grown, and thought about wanting to reintroduce myself. And I'm actually not the same person that I was when I first started doing this about 15 months ago. So I kind of want to introduce myself as the person that I am now. And I actually have a lot of parts of me that are always wanting me to grow, to improve myself, improve my offerings. Often they're creative parts and very enthusiastic parts. Sometimes they are critical parts and can deliver their messages a bit harshly, but we've worked a lot on that. So, anyway, when I was thinking about this, it took a lot of courage to step in and put this out into the world. And we noticed that as much as you love, love, love having guests on the podcast, and we want you to keep doing that and having those conversations and all the learning that goes with that, we think that you are hiding. And we think you're hiding and have more to offer than what you're offering so far. And so these parts gave me pause, and I realized that I do have some hiding parts. And I'm coming on the show today to tell you about my parts. And the idea came to call this episode Exposing My Parts. And it brought up a theme that I'm hoping might resonate with listeners as well. And I want to invite you to think about, what do you expose about yourself and what happens in your system when you have the opportunity to expose something very true and also vulnerable about yourself. So I will delve into that a little bit more today as well. Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the self-led sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. So, thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and going to dive in a little bit more now to this idea of exposing myself. And I thought I might do that by telling you a bit more about some of my parts, my passions, my polarizations, and my plans. Right there, I will introduce a part that loves alliteration. And I think that's a common part, like a part that Dick Schwartz has, who came up with the 8 C's and the 6 F's. And right there, we have some P words. And for some reason, my parts really like having things start with the same letter. They think that's really cool and somehow helps to organize our thoughts. So today, we're thinking about exposing something about my parts, my passions, my polarizations, and my plans. And before doing that, I thought I would invite you to delve a bit deeper into your own system around this theme. So I'm going to invite you to, if you're safe to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you're driving, please don't. But just to take a minute to kind of drop in inside and just see what comes up for you around this idea of self-disclosure, of sharing a little bit more about who you really are. And in what contexts does that feel good and safe and comfortable? And in what ways might that be a hard thing to do? Since this podcast is called Self-Led in Bed, I'm going to invite you to think about exposure, particularly with regard to exposing something about who you are as a sexual being, something that you feel or think or want or don't want, and how comfortable it is to speak that out loud or to share that. So you might imagine being with a close friend, and if that's a person that you feel like you could be self-disclosing with around those kinds of things. And as you're considering that, I want you to consider, how do you know if it's safe to share something tender? And sometimes we have beliefs about that, and we have some rules and parts that enforce those. That might feel very automatic. It might be something that you've actually thought a lot about, right? But how do you know? Are there thoughts that come in and say, gosh, you can't talk about this, that's off limits? Or do you have a part that's like, hey, we can say anything, anytime, we can bear it all, and that's actually important to us? So just noticing, again, maybe imagining being with a friend, a close friend, and you wanted to share something about your sexuality, your sex life, your sexual feelings, maybe a feelings for your friend. That could be like a higher level of vulnerability. So just kind of noticing what happens in your body, what happens in your emotions, what thoughts come, and how do you decide? Sometimes people have parts that might say things directly, some people might hint or avoid. So then maybe extending this inquiry into thinking about exposing something to a lover, a partner, someone who you share some kind of touch or physical intimacy with. And just noticing, say you wanted to express something, expose something you hadn't exposed before. How can you tell if it's safe to do that? What signals do you get from your body? Are there parts with jobs to prevent that or facilitate that? And maybe even there's a memory bank of times that you've done that, and if it went well or didn't go so well, those might impact what you decide to do. So there's other contexts that you might want to continue to consider in this way, like maybe something about yourself that you would choose to share or not share with someone in your family or with a doctor or a therapist. And I just like to honor the parts that show up around this, because exposing ourselves, and especially our sexual secrets, our yearnings, our fears, our sense of perhaps defectiveness or grandiosity, whatever it is, these are things that, are tender, and we want to find that balance between protecting ourselves, but also allowing some vulnerability, which might enable these parts to feel seen and heard, might let us feel more connection, and might allow us to have experiences that we long for, or to stop engaging in things that really are not safe or fulfilling. So, this guided meditation or reflection is something you can continue on your own, but I'm going to continue to talk about this topic a little bit more. And it really is an example of what I call internal consent, which is this process of slowing down and checking in inside and getting to know the parts of ourselves that have a say or have concerns or feelings or reactions that need to be considered before we make some kind of a choice. And consent is often discussed in terms of engaging in specific sexual behavior, but I like to extend the idea of consent to considering communication and how we want to show up, what we want to do, even by ourselves, how we want to spend our time. These things also are enriched by this process of pausing and listening inside and getting to know what's going on in there and seeing if we can reach some inner agreements so that then we can speak with courage and clarity the things that are important to say. So, the subject of exposing myself has led to this invitation for you to consider how you decide what you want to expose about yourself. And that brings me now back to my parts and wanting to let you know I have met with my parts and asked them about what we're comfortable sharing and not sharing. And so this will be based on that. And you also might hear me pause because some of my parts might say, hey, wait, we didn't agree on talking about this or that. So I'm living the process. I am, let's see, I'm wanting to expose myself in terms of saying that I am passionate about sexuality. That won't be a big new exposure. But it might be an exposure to let you know about some of the parts that motivate this interest for me. And I'm continually getting to know these parts. And one of the parts is a truth-telling part. Since I was quite young, I feel like I've had a part that is very attuned to what is true and what's being spoken and not spoken. And this part wants to be a truth teller and wants to name things that people may not be naming, but are being felt in the space. And when it comes to sexuality, this is a part that didn't really speak up that much when I was a kid. There weren't a lot of opportunities to do that, but every once in a while it would get up its courage and maybe ask a question or say something. But this part showed up more probably in puberty and adolescence and adulthood. That's like, hey, there's this thing going on, and I'm not sure we're quite talking about it. And I don't know, I didn't always know how to talk about it, but I feel like as I've grown and become an adult and a sex therapist, and in when I'm in therapy spaces where sexuality is not being addressed directly, this bold part likes to be one to bring it up and to point out how important it is. Um, and this bold part also has sometimes chosen to share personal information about things that I was discovering. I started to explore touching my own body, masturbation when I was pretty young, and this part was excited about that and tried to talk about that with a friend and was so not welcomed. That topic was not welcomed. I was teased, and a part of me learned that, oh, this is not something to share or to talk about. This is not safe. And so the bold part is sort of countered by a protector part who's always trying to keep it in check and like, hey, don't talk about that. That's not okay. This isn't the social setting for that. People aren't ready to hear about this. Don't talk about yourself. Don't talk about your body. And I'm really grateful to that part because it's important. It's important to be aware of what's safe and not, what's appropriate, quote unquote, appropriate, and when I want to push those boundaries and when it's not a time to push those boundaries. So I'm wanting to send a lot of love to both of those parts because I appreciate them both greatly. And let's see, what else do my parts want me to expose? Um, this kind of goes along with my passions, which I wanted to talk about. I really come alive when there's a sense of deep connection with others, also deep connection with my own parts. And for me, that connection is a somatic experience. There may be conversation, there might be some intellectual connection, there might be some emotional connection, having a conversation about something that has some vulnerability. That's kind of the payoff, right? To sharing vulnerability is that it can really open up some connection. And so these parts of me and love actually deep conversation, a sense of like when the circuit lights up and there's almost like a physical response that I get. I think I've mentioned that here on the podcast. Sometimes I just feel like truth or I feel connection and I almost feel like shudders in my body. Sometimes I almost like twitch a little bit. And that's something that's very pleasurable in my system. And I really like to feel that. And I like to help other people to feel that, to facilitate that. And that's important to me. And sexuality is an area where that can happen. Exploring sensuality is an area that can happen. But those aren't the only areas. So a part of me doesn't want me to completely pigeonhole myself in this niche around sexuality because there's a lot more to me than that. And actually, this work with self-led sexuality, the end game for me isn't just, in quotes again, about sex and our sex lives. That's certainly important. But it really is this deeper sense of connection. And there's a spiritual component to that for me, like when parts unblend, when we really welcome the body, when we can be connected with ourselves in all these different ways, when we can embrace pleasure, when we can feel seen and known and welcomed, when we feel safe, when we can experience our sensuality, when there's some room inside, some spaciousness, when we have this level of attunement and passion, all those things, there's the potential for a transcendent kind of experience where we move beyond the everyday, the material world, and it's almost like something opens up and we can feel a sense of connection to greater things, a sense of connectedness with other people, with the community, with perhaps spirit or God, and also with the earth. So that is something that I kind of want to speak to, is this passion for connection, for feeling self-led in bed is great in itself. And it also has the potential to open up a greater sense of connectedness beyond ourselves. And a part of me is reminding me about Earth Day, that my birthday is on Earth Day. And it really has been quite like a palpable part of my journey with self-led sexuality is that the more I feel embodied, the more I feel self-energy in my body, the more I feel a connection to the earth. I feel more connected to nature. I feel like what's happening, I'm like another plant in the garden in a certain way. It's really opened up this level of connection and oneness that has made me care more about recycling and what happens, in the climate movement and all things like that. So the sense of connectedness and earthy, can expand beyond our own bodies and even our connections with other people and partners into connectedness with nature, the elements, etc. So my parts want to pass that along. Something else that I want to expose is that I have some polarizations and I have parts that want to expose lots of things. They want to have me be out and loud and sharing really anything about myself, my own sex life, my own sexual orientation, the things that I like, the things that I don't like. These parts are like, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Just put it all out there, and maybe other people will recognize themselves in what you share. Maybe they'll feel more permission to share about who they are and themselves. And so that's a kind of a whole group of parts, and they have lots of different reasons that they want that. I think that's important. And on the other side, I have these protectors, and also some shy parts. So these are ones that hide, that are saying, hey, there's such a thing as privacy. You don't have to share all of that on a podcast. You don't have to tell everybody all those things about yourself in order to help them. You have the right to privacy. And once things are said, then it's hard to take them back in. And these parts have all the stories of times when I shared or disclosed things and they didn't go so well, or I was harmed in the process. So I think also in the hiding group are parts of me that are neurodivergent and just get very overstimulated and have this need to, when I've done a big exposure, even like leading a big workshop, or maybe I tell, a large group something more personal, sometimes there's a part that needs to retreat and hide. That feels more, it's almost more nervous system level, like, wow, that was a lot of exposure. We need to wrap ourselves up in our quilt and, have some quiet time to get more connected inside again. These polarizations exist around exposure and hiding. And it kind of parallels a bit a polarization where I have parts that are very extroverted that said, hey, let's do a podcast. Let's talk to people. Let's call people we don't know and have conversations, and let's get the whole world having a conversation, and you have things to teach, and or just you want to play. Then these extrovert parts want to meet all of the listeners. They want to have gatherings. And there's also, I guess, the extroverted parts and big vision parts. And then on the other side of those polarizations are some more introverted parts that are a little more shy. They're like, oh, that feels like so much exposure and a lot of, that sounds hard, right? So some parts that want to rest. And so these are polarizations, in my system that I have been hanging out with. And I'll ask you as listeners to notice, do you have some polarizations that you're noticing around exposure versus maybe hiding or privacy, extroverted versus introverted, or other kinds of polarizations that show up related to perhaps your sexuality or just your way of being in the world, your way of engaging in the world? Along these lines, I was thinking about physical exposure, and I have two very different memories. And this has to do with modesty and my physical body. And I remember when I was a child feeling really modest, like not wanting to change my clothes in front of other kids. There's a particular memory where my parents sent me to a day camp when I was little. I'm guessing I was maybe about 6 years old. I didn't feel very safe in the camp environment anyway. I didn't really understand where I was. I didn't really know the other kids. But when we had to change for swimming, there was no private area for changing, and it was mixed genders, and we all were supposed to just take off our clothes and put on our swimsuits. And I had a very modest part, and it was horrified that I was being asked to do this. And at the same time, this part was watching other kids just do it, like no qualms. And I was like, wow, I'm not exactly the same as all these other kids. They just took off their clothes, put on their swimsuits, they were ready to go. And it was like a nervous system assault. Like I cried, I didn't know what to do. And the counselors eventually noticed that this was hard for me. And I was like the special case where they had to hold up a towel for me and I would change behind the towel. So that was both helpful in terms of my modest parts, but also exposing as someone who was sensitive to that. And that felt embarrassing. My system just reminded me of that. It was sort of just so uncomfortable. It was sort of a no-win situation there for me and my young parts. And so I guess thinking about exposure, that young part shows up, and then protectors who were there, who both spoke kind of as hard as it was, didn't go along with something that wasn't comfortable to do. I didn't just take off my clothes. And parts that said, we don't want to be in situations like that where we don't have control, where we're expected to, do something and we're not in agreement with it. Or it's not comfortable for us. And so as a kid, you don't have a lot of say in that. But over time, I think I've become, at least I try to be discerning about situations where, I have some level of choice. But there's another story, and parts of me are a little embarrassed to share this story, but it's on the opposite end because I was maybe even a little younger than that. And as I'm telling this, I'm like, gosh, maybe this is why I was so modest. I don't know. Maybe I was pretty young, like maybe I want to say maybe around like 4. And we used to play outside. I lived in the suburbs, and we were on a street that was being extended, and there were actually some new houses being built. And I remember playing outside back when kids were unsupervised and like commonly unsupervised outside, just playing. And I was with another kid who was about my age, and the big trucks were driving up the street to go to the construction site. And we must have been bored. And we used to try to wave at the truck drivers and see if they would wave back at us. And some very impulsive part of me had this idea that I would pull down my pants when the truck drivers drove by. I don't know where that impulse came from. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't think I was thinking. I think I was just like trying to get attention. Some part was trying to get attention. And so truck would come by and I did that. I don't know, once or twice. And then a truck slowed down and then I got nervous. And then this truck driver leaned out the window and said, "Does your mom know you're outside doing that?" And I was ashamed and embarrassed and almost like I woke up, like, what did I just do? Like, oof, I shouldn't have done that. And then we like ran inside. And that story came back up for me as I was thinking about exposure too. Like, a gratitude that I was not harmed, that this truck driver was concerned about my well-being and not gonna take advantage or harm me or exploit me. So I'm very grateful for that. And also like curious about that impulse and how that desire to get attention, if that's what it was, or just boredom, um, like gave me that idea, and not knowing that that was something I really totally shouldn't be doing. There was a learning moment there. Maybe that's even when those protectors came in that said, don't take off your clothes in front of anyone. You need to be modest. It's, yeah, connection I'm just making now between those two experiences. So, as listeners, again, I just want to invite you to notice if any memories are coming up for you around modesty, nudity. In what ways was that comfortable and welcome as a child? In what ways were you given messages that that was not cool? Touching your own body. And what did your system do with those messages? There's some very helpful socialization and like roles that our parts take on. We really need them to take on to live in a society and be safe. But also sometimes burdens come in with that bring a dose of shame, of embarrassment, of kind of a lockdown, like I'll never do that again, or I can never expose this part of me again. So, yeah, just kind of noticing that. I'm feeling a lot of compassion for those young parts of me and sort of just the excruciating vulnerability of just being a kid generally and just not knowing the rules and finding out the hard way. And maybe parts that also are aware that there was a level of wishing maybe there was a little more guidance and some parental attunement and attention and supervision that might have also been helpful. So parts that have, some a little bit of sadness that wasn't available. So interesting how those early experiences kind of stay with us and affect the protective system as it is in the present. So I am curious how those stories land for you, if they bring up, stories of your own. And that leads me to the last P I wanted to talk about. I've talked about my parts, passions, some polarizations, and now plans. So as I am thinking about all of this and listening to parts that really want connection, and also, I forgot to mention creativity. Creativity is really a lifeline for me. And even as my story shows, I am sometimes prone toward boredom, and I'm late diagnosed with ADHD, sort of an inattentive type. And I don't like to be bored and like to keep my mind stimulated. And I am a creative person. I think it's just something about me. I don't have a specific art form that I can display per se, but creativity just really feels good in my system. And so my creative parts are wanting a space where we can connect with other people who are interested in self-led sexuality, who might be listeners like you who are listening to this podcast, or people who are in the larger community related to IFS and sexuality. And I had the idea of creating some kind of a meeting space where I can be available and people can join and ask questions or maybe send some questions along that I can respond to, and where we can have conversation. Maybe I'll have a prompt or a topic related to one of the recent podcast episodes. And, I'm hoping that this can be something that can be held loosely. I have, manager parts that know that even just doing something simple can quickly become complicated. So we're hoping it doesn't need to be complicated and that this could just be a drop in, no cost way to bring more connection for people who are interested in this content and might want to experiment with some ideas. Maybe I would even be able to workshop some new activities or exercises I've been playing around with. So I'm going to put a note in the show notes about this. And if you're in my Facebook group, it might be something I would just post as well in my Facebook group, Self-Led Sexuality with Patricia Rich. There's also a link to join that group in the show notes. And as I look forward to celebrating my birthday and Earth Day, I'm looking forward to a new phase with this podcast where there's more engagement, where I will come on a little more and expose more of my parts and maybe have guests come on who want to expose more of their parts. And yeah, that's the plan. And I also just want to offer so much gratitude to the people who have been guests so far. I've loved meeting each and every one of you, and the conversations we've had are really rich and available for everyone to listen to. So on this birthday, I feel a lot of appreciation for the guests and all the people, who have helped me get this far in life. So wishing you a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. And I actually have a pretty exciting guest lined up for the next episode. Take care. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.